Good evening, everybody. I am so pleased today to welcome Dr. Stephen Page, professor of saxophone at University of Texas at Austin, alto player in the Zizek Quartet, just a wonderful musician and a really good friend and a great person to have in Texas with me. Please help me welcome Dr. Page.
Hey everybody, great to be here. Thank you, Dr. Nab, for putting on this great series. It's really gotten huge, and it's so nice to see so many presentations with so many great people.
Yeah, and I should also say, for those of us keeping track of what day it is still, happy birthday to you. It is Monday, April 13th, and so happy birthday to you.
Thanks, thanks. Yeah, it's been a good day so far. Lots of teaching, and get to sort of cap it off with this. So yeah, thanks everybody for being here. It's a special one, that's for sure.
Um, so, I gave a brief introduction to you, but I've been doing this with everybody we talk to. Just give us some of your background.
Sure. Yeah, I was born and raised in South Florida. A lot of people seem to associate me with the Midwest since I lived there for quite a long time. But I was, born in Florida and a product of the public school band system. That's sort of what ignited my love for music. And from there, I went at 18. I moved to Minneapolis to attend the University of Minnesota. And then from there, I went to IU at the Jacob School for my master's, and then on to the University of Iowa, my doctorate. Once I finished up with my education, I moved to Colorado for a few years, where I taught at Colorado Mesa University, which was a really exceptional experience, before we relocated down here to Texas. And so we've been here now. This is my 6th year on the faculty of UT, which has flown by in an instant.
Right. Yes, absolutely. It doesn't seem like 6 years, but I know how.
Yeah.
This is my 10th year, so I get it.
Wow.
So yeah, that's great. One of the questions that we saw have seen a lot, and I just kind of wanted to touch on this with you too. And this is a way to kind of branch into a lot of the questions that were posed to you, which is like, what are your either fundamental, like the most important fundamental things that you're playing, or important fundamental things that you're teaching, and how is that reflected in either your daily routines or your warm-ups, or what you're doing with your students?
Yeah, sure. For me, the warm-up is just, it's so crucial to my day overall. I really try to structure like my daily schedule in a way that I can always play for a little while, especially before I start teaching, because I want to feel like I'm ready to be on the horn and work with my students. So it's really crucial to me. I've been doing pretty much the same routine for, I don't know, quite a long time now, 6, 7, 8 years, where I've really found something that works for me every day. And that's a combination of starting on the mouthpiece and getting warmed up there, and then moving to the full horn and doing some long tones, and really getting a sense for opening up my ears for the day, getting the air flowing, and sort of getting the fingers to work, moving into scales and some other routines. If I don't do that before I teach, it feels always uncomfortable to me. And I basically try to plan it so I can warm up for the day once every morning, and then as I'm practicing intermittently, as we all do, as the schedule allows, I can maybe move into whatever other things are sort of on the agenda. But for me, the warm-up is essential, and if I'm going to sacrifice anything in the day, that I'm going to be playing, it'll never be the warm-up. I think a lot about like our brass playing friends, and their routine is so important to them, and just how relentless they are in pursuing that every day. And I sort of try to align myself with that, so that anything I need to call upon to do when I'm playing repertoire or working with my quartet or with my students, that I can be assured that I can do that.
Right.
Yeah,
so you said do you start with mouthpiece?
Yeah, pretty much every day. Just making sure that I'm getting the air flowing, nice stable sound, good pitch, doing some pitch bends, just getting everything sort of loosened up for the day's work, really.
Right. And so are you an A, B flat, or what's your preference there?
I'm an A person. That's good for me.
Right.
But I mean, there's obviously variation, depends on the person. We're all just anatomically different depending on what you're working with. Might be a little higher, it might be a little lower, and and that's all great. We just got to find what works for us. So for me, it's an A and a C on soprano. Those are my two main voices that I play. So
So, and that's interesting. So, in terms of your when you're, so you have like anatomical caveats for what goal notes are.
I mean, I just not particularly in terms of like if your jaw is shaped this way, you should do this. No, but just I think it's important that we all identify that we're made differently.
Right.
Interestingly, for me, in the middle of my graduate studies, and you might remember because we were friends then, that I had braces like through my doctorate, and I had a palate expansion, and so like things changed really drastically for me at like a sort of advanced age, and especially like with my artistry. So going through that process changed how I approached the horn, and it sort of brought a lot of awareness to that fact that we're all very different in the way we approach these fundamentals. Yes, we're aiming towards certain goals, but we're going to approach it slightly differently.
Yeah, 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 for sure. So, okay, so we got mouthpiece, and then scales, intervals. I mean, is there a specific amount of time that you allot to this, or do you just have goals that you're wanting out of it?
I mean, I'm usually playing a couple different scale patterns every day. I might pick, 5 or 6 keys to roll through, just to sort of, yeah, kind of get the technique woken up for the day. It sort of depends, but I do cycle through. Like I've got a couple different scale patterns, and then scales and thirds and fourths. I'm pretty grounded in. I like to do that. That helps get things moving, and it's not necessarily always fast either. Of course, I think there's a lot of value in going slowly or changing how we work with the metronome and taking some of that data from the metronome away. I got this metronome maybe like a year and a half ago, and it goes down to 15, which is super slow. But then if you try to play like 4, 5, 6, 7 counts inside of that pulse, like that tells us a lot about our
Right.
technique and our subdivision. And so I'm finding myself spending a lot of time down there with the metronome. Um,
What metronome is that?
it's a small Peterson. It's called a body beat, this little white thing.
Oh,
It's
right.
really great.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
So, so then, so we've got scales and intervals. Now, what about articulations?
Yeah, that's sort of rolled into the scale stuff.
Patterns?
And same thing, like working on articulation with various, metronome subdivisions, just to again work on these things. We love to speed up through articulations when it's at a certain tempo, and just sort of opening the ears up to what's going on.
Right, right. And I personally, I try and vary speed a lot when I'm playing scales. Like, I mean, I do you think about like, when we talk a lot about articulation and how you want like make sure that you're moving efficiently and you're consistent in it. I find that hand position, and you're somebody with impeccable hand position, I should say.
Thank you.
Do you think of this in terms of like having a groove for the same motion with your fingers as well?
Yeah, I think so. It's this idea, well, for me anyway, like aim small, miss small. If the technique is nice and concise, and you're really grounded in the horn, and you're very like naturally approaching the instrument, like things should just work really well. The
Right.
second we let tension into the game, like we're going to have a problem. Tension's the enemy. And especially too with just like musicians' wellness, right? We got to take care of our artistry, and that can be really tied into the way we approach the instrument. Lots of our friends and our students, we've seen plenty of people go through some hardship with hand and wrist and shoulder and neck problems, and I think a lot of that is to do with, of course, the fact that we've got between 5 and 15 pounds of metal hanging from our neck at any given time, and then just how we approach it. So, and I'm rather tall. I don't think anybody would argue that fact. So like that changes some things for me too, with just how like the alto is sort of an awkward instrument for me to hold. So I have to be pretty careful about like my wrists in particular. And I found a good way to just sort of like naturally, connect with the instruments. And but yeah, I mean those scales and patterns really help me work on those motions, especially the ones that are the most cumbersome. Things with the pinkies, my ring fingers are also much like everyone. They're a lot rather lazy from time to time. So yeah, this is all helpful.
Yeah. And so do you reinforce with your students this kind of a routine as well?
Yeah, they will tell you that I'm rather diligent about it with them, and I think they see the value, and they see the If you're putting in your time on your fundamentals and really doing these things with a purpose, I think that's a big part of it too. We don't just play long tones to say like, well, I played that note for 10 seconds, check, what's next? But, examining all the aspects of what you're doing, you'll really see a lot of growth, especially I think with some of the baseline fundamentals, your mouthpiece pitches, things like that. Like you're going to enhance your sound really quickly if you're really approaching it well. And same is true with your technique. If we're really approaching the scales well and working through that scale rubric, and being honest about holding ourselves accountable, and that goes for you and me too. We're not done growing. Then we keep making progress.
So along those lines, then, what are some of the common, because we've actually talked about mouthpiece pitches and these things quite a bit in terms of approach. What are some of the common either misconceptions or I guess misunderstandings about how to implement that? And do you see people getting that A but doing it incorrectly? And if so, how?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's so easy to produce like a false positive in a certain way. And especially like the Texas band system too, like with what I know, and I'm not, I definitely know a lot of students and teachers, but I'm not, as involved as some of my colleagues who are like really invested in the private teaching and seeing that type of thing. But it's easy to sort of, I think, for us to go to something like the mouthpiece pitch and produce an A and do it sort of the wrong way. But the telltale sign is always the sound.
Yeah.
If you're trying to get that A on the mouthpiece and you're getting it, but the sound has, no focus, or it seems like it's constantly wanting to jump up to a C, that tells us something.
Right.
But now it's interpreting that data. So like that's where our facilitation as teachers becomes so important, of like trying to guide towards like hearing the difference between when it's done correctly versus when it's not quite hitting that mark, or when there's still room for growth, and opening up someone's ears to that difference. I think like that's what it all comes down to, is we're trying to open whoever we're working with, open their ears to something new that they can't hear or have not taken notice of before.
Totally. And that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, is like once you get that, having them recognize it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually hearing that, and that can be sometimes the hardest step, actually, is to break the physical habit and to be able to hear it when you do break it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's great. So, one of the questions that's kind of, I mean, I think certainly related to this, both in your teaching, but also just in your playing as well. Like, what made you decide to study, I guess, first with Rousseau and then within his school of students?
Sure. It was very fortunate where I grew up. As I mentioned, in South Florida, I got linked up with a teacher, thanks to a friend of mine, who I knew was taking lessons. And, he was 2 years older than me, and he was the principal in our wind ensemble in high school. And he was fabulous, fabulous musician. So I wanted to do what, clearly he had something happening, and it was really great. So he said, yeah, I'm taking with this private teacher down in Palm Beach, which is about 40 miles from where I lived. And so I was connected with him and started taking lessons. His name's Anthony Ciccarelli. Now he was a retired orchestral musician, and through working with him, I eventually figured out more about him. And he had played with the Philadelphia Symphony and Cleveland and Houston. He was in McLean's class at the Curtis Institute in the late 40s, and he was in Ted Buteau's chamber music class. So a fabulous musician by every right, and a very, very good saxophone player. He knew Sigurd Rascher, and so he was just one of these, very well connected, had an exceptional career. And so I started taking lessons with him. And at that point, when I really started in with him, I was most interested in jazz, and that's where I had found a lot of love for music making. And in one of my first lessons, I was working on a piece for solo and ensemble, and he pulled down an LP, and we listened to it together. And it was Eugene Rousseau's Concerto LP, which of course is very, very famous, on Deutsche Grammophon, which has now been re-released on CD, I should add. and so that was a rather life-changing moment for me. I had not really been aware of saxophone quite in that capacity. I had done some research for other, solo and ensemble type things, as most young high schoolers do, but that was a pretty revelatory moment. And so I was pretty hooked on this new side of the saxophone, and then really just started listening as much as I could to a lot of different players, and but Rousseau always stuck with me. And I think that same summer, I went to one of his master classes up in Shell Lake, and met him for the first time and had several lessons, and we hit it off. And as they say, the rest is history. Now, I applied to other schools, of course, but I was really invested in wanting to go study with him. And this is right around the time when he left IU, so there was a little bit of a shuffle there. But it was I think the best thing for me. That was an amazing experience, not only to study with Dr. Rousseau, and those 4 years were absolutely amazing, but to be in Craig Kirchhoff's wind ensemble all 4 years, and to get to see Bert Hara do some teaching, and I started my bassoon studies at the University of Minnesota, and then to be in that city and get a $5 rush ticket to see Minorg or St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. I mean, that's incredible. Sure. So it was really fortunate. But those 4 years with Dr. Rousseau were amazing, and we remained very close. I talked to him on the phone just a few days ago, and yeah, he's still a big mentor for me.
That's great. So then from there you went to IU and then ultimately Iowa, and so I assume through your being at Minnesota, you had a chance to meet Dr. Murphy and Che, or was that just, had you set goals for yourself later on?
I mean, I think much like a lot of our students, we have artists that are inspiring to us, and pedagogues who we've had the chance to work with, who are always on the radar, and as were these two artists for me at every point in my development. I applied to IU as an undergrad as well, and I applied to Iowa for a master's degree, and along with a lot of other schools too. And I think those two artists really spoke to me. Their pedagogy really spoke to me, and it just worked out at the times that it did to go study at IU for those 2 years. And again, a really, really amazing 2 years as a student there at such an institution. And Dr. Murphy, we all know, is such an incredible musician and a wonderful human being. And then to move on to Iowa after that, and do my DMA and work with Dr. Che, who really showed me a lot of very important and new things, and was just an incredible mentor. It was a really, really fortuitous time, I would say. And I feel like I studied with the teachers that I got to study with, like, at the right time for me. Like, Otis was perfect for the master's. For that was like the time that I needed his insight. I really needed that insight. And then Dr. Che, the same sort of thing. I really needed that next step at that time, and he was the person to do it. And so it really worked out beautifully, I think. I'm really grateful for that progression.
Mm. And of course, the IU is Isaac's formation there, right?
Yeah. We all got started there 13 years ago. We were just playing together a few months ago, playing a concerto in South Dakota, and we're thinking about those early days of early rehearsals in the Musical Arts Center, for those of you who might know what that is, in the basement there, and in some of the dressing rooms, and just trying to work it out. And Dana and Matt were, Matt was an undergrad, and Dana was a first-year master's student, and Stacy was at the end of her doctorate. I was at the second year of my master's. We're all in very different places academically, and trying to make that schedule work. But we were only together in one place for a year.
I didn't know. For some reason, I thought you were that was your first year. So that started your second year.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we played together for that year, and had a lot of success. We worked with a lot of composers at IU, which was really, really great, and premiered a lot of new music, and did the NASA competition. And that was the first year of the NASA quartet competition, and H2 won first prize, and then we won the second prize, and a group from the North Carolina School of the Arts won the third prize. And then we all, I went to Iowa, and Stacy got the job at West Point. And so we sort of, started spreading out in the world, and Matt and Dana stayed put at IU for a few more years, and Dana got into the Navy Band, and Matt went up to Rochester to Eastman for his second master's and his DMA. and now they're all sort of in that region, which is really great. So
Yeah, yeah, that's so um, let's see. So I think that, well, and quartet can certainly come into play with this too. One of the other questions that I think we both thought were interesting was about score study and preparation for new pieces. Like, in fact, I mean, I would be interested to know how it's the same and how it's different. If you're playing solo, working on solo rep or working on quartet rep, and the difference between maybe if you're premiering a piece versus, a piece that everyone's familiar with, like Days of Glow Quartet or something like that, or Schmidt.
sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, the score study, it has to be so integral for us because it's so informative. And when we're looking at solo repertoire, I think it helps inform the artistic decision of a lot of what you're doing, especially if it's a new work to you, and what you're deciding to do interpretively. I can't imagine like approaching thinking about like the Schmidt Legend, which is like one of my favorite standard pieces of literature, and I've recorded it and performed it a bunch. You have to know that piano part so well, because it informs so much of the way Schmidt writes, and that's impressionistic music, and like how we can approach this rhythmically, and how important it is that like the way he writes rhythmically come across well. The same is true of like thinking of another like Tomasi, and how that like bitonality and the pitch centers and the set class that he's using, like how that informs your interpretation, because it's all there. We're just sort of deciphering a map in a very clear way, I think. And that's sort of, I think, one of the most rewarding parts of building an interpretation, really sort of discovering the music in that way. It's a different experience even from a listening standpoint. If we sit down with our solo score and we say, okay, today I'm listening to Albright, and I look at the saxophone part, my ear goes right to that. And now I'm like sort of missing out on part of it. But if I sit down with the score, now I'm really able to aurally focus on the interplay, or just look at a single line of the piano and really get focused in on what's happening in that the right hand or that left hand. Which, especially, the more complex the music, and we love our complex music, the easier it is when we put it together. So I think it's really, really an integral part of what we do. With chamber music, much the same. Especially in a situation where we're not all together at the time with Isaacs, like understanding the score or just having an aural capacity for the music becomes really, really important, because when we show up, we might just have one go time. I just mentioned Isaacs was together last month. We played the Balkan Concerto Grosso with Wind Ensemble, and that was something different for us, and that was new, and so we had to be really comfortable about getting there all together. And having one rehearsal, and then stepping on stage with that group to have a rehearsal with them, and then it's time for the show.
Right. Yeah. So so you mentioned Albright before,
Sure.
right? So I mean, that piece, obviously, most everybody listening to this or watching this will be familiar with that piece. Um, there's so much to find in a score, right? And listening, like how much do you listen and study versus study, and like balance that? Because I know certain teachers or certain players come down on different sides of that coin in terms of, oh, I want to do my own thing and I don't want somebody else's interpretation to inform mine, or other people rely on that. So I would be interested in knowing where you will fall in that.
It's tough, right? Because we love to listen to our models, and it's a really important part of how we learn, I think. If we take it all the way back, like Dr. Nab, you have a young child, and as she's learning to talk, it's imitation, right?
Right.
The same is true for us, and even going back to beginning band, or maybe if we did some studies prior to those experiences, a lot of it is rote, initially. So I think there's something to that, and I know, like, if I'm learning a piece that's new to me, and if I listen to it 2 or 3 times, having an aural map, I think it really helps actually my technique, like learning it faster, because I just know what the intervals are. That's how I learn. I know that's just helpful for me. But I do think score studying while listening is helpful. I do think studying away from that aural input is also helpful. I tend to think a lot about composites. How do the lines interact? And being able to sort of sing that composite can be really helpful. So those are things that, especially with complex music, that I'll definitely employ as a matter of helping me understand better like the zoomed out version of the music. Because if we're only looking at our part that's very zoomed in, that's very important, yes. But at some point we have to zoom back out and see how, what does it look like from 10,000 feet? Is it still the same?
Right. Um, so along those lines, then, when you come back to a piece, I think that for me, and I mentioned this with Professor Rickmeyer when we were talking. I love coming back to a piece because you always hear different things. You're a different person. You're, a different player. Um, and but I find myself, you're talking about the mapping and imitating. Even though I find different things, I find like there's a certain amount of programming that I have to rewire uh, in order to get to that. That's one of the fun challenges for me, is actually like getting rid of the old map.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you find the same thing to be true or not.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And I think I had this conversation a lot in the fall with some of my students who were preparing for NASA and visiting the eBear or revisiting the eBear, right? And I think very specifically about that piece, and the same thing for me. If like I played it in high school and learned it then, and then again in undergrad, and then again when I was at UT, I played it with the orchestra up at University of Oklahoma for one of our regional NASAs, and I hadn't played it in 10 years, probably taught it a zillion times, but like those pieces, like you say, they become so ingrained in us based on the way we learned it at some point. But then our artistry grows. Like we continue to grow, and then we come back and suddenly we're like, oh, we think, wow, it's like it got harder in the last 10 years because we hear more, we have more ideas, we're more informed. And I'm sure that like when I first learned eBear in high school, I'm sure it was like technically proficient, I would venture to say. But I'm positive I never thought about the fact that like, oh, when you play the altissimo A at the bottom of the first page, it's in octaves with the trumpet. We should really be aware of that.
Right.
Um, that I'm sure it's nothing that ever crossed my mind. But now, like, more, a little bit more growth has happened. There's more openness in my ears. I'm going to approach the music very differently. And I think that's a great thing. That keeps music that we know fresh every time we pull it out.
Right. Yeah.
We're aiming at a moving target always.
Right. And I find that um, with my students, when I'm working on a piece that maybe I haven't played in a little bit, I have to go back and I think about, I'll look in my part and see the fingerings that I used then versus the fingerings that I think should work now. I'm like, oh, well, I guess I missed that opportunity back 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Too.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I have all those fingerings in my eBear, like on the cadenza and stuff. And you go like, what were you thinking?
Right.
But that's part of it. Our vocabulary is constantly growing, and mastery is the result of intelligent effort. And as we continue to put in that effort, now we've got something new to bring to the music every time.
Right. So another one of the questions, which is related to this, like how do you differentiate your profession, your preparation for playing as a soloist with a large ensemble versus normal performance prep with piano or chamber music? Is it different?
At a certain point, yes. I mean, learning the music, I would say my process is much the same. It might change based on the piece. Like I was learning John Mackey's concerto several years ago, which I played a lot, and I love that piece. That's a massive work. There's a different sort of, you almost have to like train for that. It's 30 minutes. And I think for those of us who have performed the piece, and I know you have, Dr. Nab, you get to the end of the third movement and you sort of try to catch your breath and you realize there's still two more to go. So that's a different type of, preparation in that sort of sense of not only is the music just very, very challenging with its expressive content and its technique, but its endurance. It is a marathon. When it comes then to, sort of the last stages of preparation for me of a concerto, say, whether it was orchestra or wind ensemble, then I start to think a lot about my place on the stage and my place inside and outside of the ensemble. Again, score study becomes really important about like who am I paired with, what should I be listening for, and then also too where I should be directing my actual physical attention in the space. I think we spend so much of our lives playing with piano, which is, of course, wonderful. But that, for me anyway, the way I set up is to the right. That's where I'm communicating. But with playing with a large ensemble, it's to the left. So really trying to get used to, for me, get used to that idea of like, I need to communicate over here. That's been important, just to make sure that I'm giving my best to my colleague on the podium and to my colleagues in the ensembles, whatever they might be, so we can, really make sure that things come together the way we all want them to. Chamber music, much the same, of like, having a good understanding of where you sit inside the ensemble. And for me in the alto chair, I'm always pretty aware of like texture, because I think the alto voice can just get lost in a hurry.
Right.
And that's always been, for me in my group, historically something that I've had to really be careful of. But I think, specifically in chamber music too, with, sort of preparing, if we're preparing a new piece, I think we've played together for so long that we know each other's characteristics. We had an instance maybe 2 or 3 years ago. We were going on tour up in the Northeast to UMass Amherst and Mansfield, and we were supposed to premiere Mark Mellett's new quartet, Ex Machina, which has 7 movements, all these different quartets. And we got the music on Wednesday, and we had our first performance on Friday. And Thursday was a travel day, or no, Wednesday was a travel day. The music met us in New York, so we just had to do it really quickly. And so having the opportunity to like score study very quickly and understand how we all interpret means we can get to that, successful performance quickly. Now that's sort of a rushed scenario. We usually, that's not necessarily always the most comfortable, but sometimes that's what it has to be.
Yeah. So I think one of the challenges that I've had, the difference between either saxophone and piano or saxophone quartet or mixed chamber ensemble versus being a soloist as well, is you're dealing with conductor and communication between you and the conductor, but also communication between you and the ensemble and communication between the conductor and the ensemble, right? And so knowing it, not unlike quartet, knowing when to lead, knowing when to follow, knowing when to blend in, but it's the extra step, the of the conductor and the ensemble can often, and even the size of the stage, how much time delay there is. I mean, do you what kind of capacity do you commit to that kind of preparation? Just imagining the different scenarios.
I mean, yeah, well, it's an important question, right? Like, and it's definitely one that, I mean, you don't always have. So like, yeah, I'm thinking, I played like in Bates, and you've been in Bates before at UT, which is a big space. I think it holds 750 or 800 people. Really a beautiful venue. I know what to expect there. So we played a concerto on like I think a Thursday night with the wind ensemble, and then Thursday night I drove down to San Antonio, and Friday night I played it at TMEA in that 5,000 person giant hall, where I didn't really have a chance to step on stage prior. That's a little uncomfortable, but sometimes that's just what we have to do, and we have to adapt.
Right.
But it's definitely something to think of, that I think about, how to move your sound in maybe a slightly different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that ensembles are going to do that to a certain point as well.
Right. Okay, so what advice do you have for young professionals or graduate students? Career advice. How can you advise them?
I mean, it's always a great question, and it's a good one that we get all the time. And I think it's important to have these conversations with people, as much as we can. And I think a big thing that I'm glad to see us talking more and more about is what a career in the arts could look like. One thing that I've said a lot with my students or individuals who I'm lucky enough to work with at various places is that there's no one version of success. And my version of success is no one else's. And that's a really great thing for us in that, there's so much we can do with these skills we have, with this artistry that we continue to grow, and in this community with which we get to live in. I've grown fond of saying recently that, there's been no better time to be an artist in the world than now. As much as we like to talk about how difficult it is, and it is difficult, it's not to necessarily say that it's not, but there's just so much opportunity. So really, for us, I think to understand what we could be doing in the arts is really a great thing, and one that leaves us feeling artistically content and like we're contributing and really feel like fulfilled about what we're doing. I look around at our field and I'm constantly inspired by, the variation we're seeing with like careers. If we look at like let's say we just talk about like the instrument itself, like the saxophone and the things we need for the instrument. Well, there are people like Shelley Tanabe and Brendan Lagan and Will Peak who are really advancing the field through their artistry, because they're great saxophonists, and then their knowledge of the instrument. Innovating with design, innovating with technology, working with instrumentalists in a totally different way. Other people who are doing great things like with Yamaha and with Music Medic, and there's just so much happening. With arts development and arts management. The opportunity to have an incredible career in the arts is much wider than I think we realize. And I know that was something that I explored myself a lot, and I'm definitely really glad to see other people exploring that and these conversations taking place, because there's so much we can do. There's so much we can do.
Yeah, and it's been you mentioned Will and Brenna, and it's been really amazing to see the kind of the next generation of people, I guess, really revolutionizing a lot of the way we, and they're great saxophonists in their own right, and then taking that skills and that knowledge of the instrument and then applying it to the repair side is amazing. It's a kind of a game changer for those of us lucky enough to live close to them, and so yeah. And so then, what about like the traditional tracks have been, either if you're a saxophonist, you can go all the way through. You're going to be a university professor, or you might have in Texas, as you know, there are a lot of folks who decide to go out and teach 90 to 100 students in a lot of the school districts, yeah. Or try to do the military band thing. How do you communicate this larger world? Like how do you reinforce that and try to open up people's perspectives to all of those options?
It's a great question. Like how do you you mean to say like how do we get away from these like just couple tracks that you mentioned, or
how do we it's easy to be very kind of have tunnel vision towards like a thing, and I think it's important to be goal oriented, of course, but to open up from an early age your options to be able to, and of course we haven't even talked about the hundreds of people each year that graduate and get great jobs as educators in the primary and secondary schools.
Of course.
But, in this advanced field, like how do you get them thinking about that early on?
Well, I mean, as much as I'm able to, like talking about it or having guests in to talk about their amazing career. Like I know Matt Hess has been going around to schools and talking about all the great things he does as like a repair tech, and he's a teacher and doing cool things. I've had like Jeff Peterson, who works for Yamaha, come in and talk about what he does. He's a great saxophonist, and he's a repair and R&D acoustical wizard. Right. So the more that we can highlight these amazing things, I think the better. We've had some really incredible panels at various NASA's that are to do with like what like arts enterprise is looking like these days with,
Mhm.
people like Sean Murphy, who is, running a really successful publishing company, or like my own wife, who runs a really great business. There are so many people doing so many interesting things now that are still really well connected in our community. And I think, having those conversations, highlighting those people, and celebrating their success is, really, really important because, yeah, it's really easy to get caught up into this idea of, um, a more narrow focus of what could be.
Right.
When what could be is so wide, and it's really whatever you want it to be.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the more interfacing with people like you're doing with people, within the music industry in every way. And of course, Scott Campbell
Yeah.
and Christoph and Mike Finolio were on last week talking about this very thing. I mean, that's the more exposure that we have to that, it opens people's eyes completely. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, um, okay, so let's see what else. Oh, what were some of the biggest challenges inheriting a large kind of well-known studio at UT?
Sure. Yeah. So I came to UT from Colorado, where I taught for 2 years, and it was, like you say, a very well known studio. Harvey Patel had just retired after, I believe, 30 years. And there are always challenges, and a big challenge for me was that it was a very big change from what I had been doing in Colorado. Just to give a little bit of insight, that job at Colorado Mesa University, I taught saxophone, applied clarinet, and applied bassoon, all of which I've studied. And I still have the days where I miss my bassoon a little bit because it's been a little while since I've played my doubles. And I taught jazz improv one, jazz combo, orchestration, woodwind pedagogy, all 5 instruments, music technology, and then service. So I like ran the recording studio and did a bunch of other things. So it was a lot. It was a big job. Um, and I had like 16 students, so I was just teaching a lot of applied lessons too, but then also lecturing these other courses. Um, so I got to UT, and it was all applied teaching, chamber music, service, the usual things. It was definitely an adjustment, um, just in that I had the opportunity to really focus on some different things that were really inviting. Of course, jumping into any new system is a challenge, and learning sort of how you fit inside the various sort of subsets of a university. Like, well, how do things run inside the woodwind area, inside the brass wind percussion area, inside the School of Music, and just learning all these new systems. Um, but the students were amazing. I got to sort of jump in with these students who already had great things happening, and they had a great studio vibe. They were working hard, and they were just ready to keep working, which was just awesome. We got to immediately start helping people prepare their degree recitals and helping them move towards graduation and jobs and graduate school and all these things. So that was like hugely rewarding. I would say the hardest thing was actually with some of these students being at the end of their time at UT, right as I was starting mine. Several of them graduated right in that first year, and we just sort of get things clicking, and it was sort of a little bit of a heartbreak to see some of them move on to careers in graduate school, because I would have loved to have a couple more years with them. Now that's a great thing, of course, that they're moving on, but that was definitely kind of tough in a certain light. So yeah, it was definitely a change, and going to also from a small town in Colorado of about maybe 65,000 to one of the coolest cities around, I think, Austin, which is rather large at about 1 million people. So yeah, but it was a great experience to sort of transition here, and it really started flowing very quickly. And I'm really fortunate to be, in such a welcoming environment with my students and my colleagues.
Yeah. And so along the lines of the students, another one of the questions is, what are you looking for, and or maybe what have you noticed about since you've been teaching, like about the level of students? And I mean, I think we all acknowledge the fact that the level just keeps exploding upward in terms of um, what high school students are capable of now is just when I was in high school, it's just kind of unthinkable.
Yeah.
Um, and it's amazing. And so, what are you looking for? And do you have any just observations of what students are doing now?
Yeah, I mean, the level is just, I mean, it's just so wild how fast it's grown.
Yeah,
I feel like, in a certain sense, I'm not that far removed. I keep saying that, but it is my birthday. I'm becoming more far removed from my own experience in high school.
moved.
Yeah, yeah. Um, but the level is just exploding, and that's so exciting for so many reasons. That people are so interested and so invested so early, and they're and a lot of that I think is very positively due to technology. They just have access. I think people in our bracket, Dr. Nab, remember the days of like trying to search down recordings, and like online ordering was just sort of becoming a thing, and like getting music was difficult, and now it's just simpler, so there's just more access, which is really, really great. In terms of students, of course, you and I are both in Texas, and there's great things happening here with that, and we're lucky to be able to witness that. Um, what I'm looking for in prospective students, always people who are really excited about what's ahead for them, about their education, who are wanting to be very proactive about their next steps and growing their artistry and growing their citizenship. These are the future stewards of the field, and I think making sure that we're on the same page as to what we can do together to help them reach their goals is really important. And that's something that's really important to me. Like, I view my job as an educator as the most important thing I can do is positively enable and facilitate that student achieving their version of success. So if you want to come because you really want to go be the best middle school band director in a small community, great, let's make that happen. If you want to be the best high school band director in the state of Texas, I can't guarantee that, but let's make sure we really work hard to make sure you're set to make that leap. If you want to go on to graduate school and further your artistry, we'll get you there. Let's make it happen. So, it's really inspiring every year to see, for all of us who get to see these applications come across our desk and see these amazing young people who are so invested and so excited, and already many of them doing such incredible things at all levels, high school, all up through the grad spectrum. Um, yeah, it's a really amazing thing. The only other thing that I try to tell students is that I'm auditioning for them as much as they're auditioning for me. I think we all want that really positive relationship with the person who we get to see the most one-on-one during our time, and that's really crucial to, I think, helping find that version of success. Um, so yeah, I think there's definitely a lot in that process that's so crucial, and I think the saxophonists are a particularly amazing group of young people with the types of things that they're doing, and the artistry that they're bringing to the table, and the really sharp, critical, inquisitive, and forward thinking that they're doing about their art and their place in the world.
Yeah, and so along those lines, and I guess I in what you were talking about, when they become a student, um, and when we were students, I mean, the access to competitions now has just kept growing and growing and growing.
Yeah.
How 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 integral would you say the competition process? Because I know you've done and were successful in many. How much of a, I mean, that's an extrinsic motivator, right? And
Sure.
so how much of that was important for you and is important for your students? And do you encourage it, or how do you think about that?
Well, I mean, this is a great question, and like we see, obviously, on this, since gamer groups have done so well for a long time in these competitions, and that's awesome. It's a testament to our artistry, to our music, and to the level, with which we're performing. Um, it's yeah, it's astounding. Just look at the last couple of years of like Fish Off, and like what great things have happened there, and that's exciting. But the biggest thing that I try to stress with anybody who's undergoing competitions is just to have a healthy relationship with that. The word itself is already in a certain way negative,
Right.
but one of my students has said this often. It's posted actually on her the door to her office, is that the prize is in the process.
Mm.
And whether you go to this competition and you take home a medal or an accolade of some kind, or you just became a better artist because of it, there's multi sides to that, and that if we can view it from that vantage point of, again, maybe zooming out is a good analogy. What can we get from this process? We grow our artistry. Maybe we get to travel, and I love to travel, and that was a big positive point of competing for me, was getting to visit some places that I didn't really know and got to explore. And then meeting like other young people who are just as entrenched in finding their voice as you are. That's a huge part of it. For me, it was, I will say, like thinking about the people who I got to meet, saxophonists and non-saxophonists who were there at these events, and many of whom are still very close friends today. And, when we were sort of on that circuit, if you will, like, we'll see you in Michigan this weekend and we'll see you in California the weekend after, and, the same faces sort of come around. And, I think that's an amazing part of this. So, the competition scene itself has so much to offer. But I think relating to it in a really healthy, positive way is the best thing we can do. Prizes are great. And like you said, I did a lot of competitions and I won a lot of competitions. And I'm grateful for that opportunity. But there's always another winner. If you think about like Clyburn and Tchaikovsky and, our own competitions, there's always going to be another winner. And so at some point, that the importance of having gotten the medal or whatever, where does it stand 10 years on?
Right. Right. Yeah, totally. That's a great answer. So, all right, now for a fun one. And by the way, everybody, if you have questions, as usual, just put them in the chat, and we will get to them. I see that you have several birthday wishes for you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, everybody.
Okay. But yeah, if you do have questions for him, absolutely, please let us know. What are your favorite things about Australian culture?
So I think that question came from my pal and also exceptional saxophonist, Andrew Smith. I guess I'm sort of an honorary Australian these days. But certainly cuisine down in Australia is exceptional. We had a good time when we visited a few years ago after our wedding. But the big thing is that I'm a rather huge peanut butter fan. It's one of my favorite go-to foods. Australians don't eat peanut butter, so in that sense, there's just more for me, which is good.
An Australian very close to you has just written in Vegemite. So
Yes, that also. I do like Vegemite. I'm like the only American that eats that stuff.
right. Wait, so they don't eat peanut butter in Australia?
It's not, I mean, they have it in grocery stores. It's just not very popular.
Hmm.
Here it's such a staple, like American food, right? Like, especially going back to when we were kids, like, peanut butter and jelly. It's a staple of every 5-year-old's diet.
Ask you one of the hardest hitting questions: Did crunchy or creamy or extra
Oh,
crunchy?
extra crunchy.
Right, fair enough. We're on the
Yeah.
same page with that one.
Oh, yeah.
All right. We have a question from Ethan here. He says, "What about the Rousseau mouthpieces keeps you coming back to it instead of switching to a Selmer or a Van Doren?"
Sure. So, yeah, I've played the Rousseau mouthpieces since I was, I guess, 15 or 16 years old. Um, so I mean, in that sense, it's home base, and it's been a big part of my artistic life for a long time. For me, it just offers the right sort of balance of the sound concept that I'm going for, something that's very warm and very round and very responsive, but very flexible. So if I need to move brighter, that's easy. If I need to move darker, then I can. So for me, that's just sort of the best blending of all these sort of factors. I've played Van Dorens, I've played Selmers, of course, and I always have them on hand for my students who want to try them. But yeah, for me, the Rousseau is the right fit. And it just seems to be the thing I always come back to.
So a natural outgrowth of that, um, that question was, so what has been the largest thing that has influenced your concept of sound? So you were talking about just now, you were talking about your sound concept. Like, what are your
Mhm.
biggest influences there?
Uh, I mean, of course, listening, like I listen to a lot of string players, I listen to a lot of voice. In wind playing too, I'm quite fond of, as you might have guessed, clarinet. So those are a lot of the big influences for me. But I mean, that's me trying to find an individual voice. Like I want to be my own artist, of course. Um, but as it's written on my office on the whiteboard, sound is everything. That's what we have to work with. So, finding a sound that sort of suits us and that is something we're comfortable with, from there, if that sound can be sculpted in whatever way we want, then we've got a good medium, you
Mm.
know. If we start with something that, if I started with a mouthpiece that didn't suit me well or it was way too bright, I'm going to have a really hard time getting it down to the dark I want at that time. And same thing vice versa. So for me, like everything about the Rousseau puts me sort of right in that center space where I can sort of move out anywhere I want and feel really good about that.
Sure. Yeah. So Evan asks, uh, can you expand your read break-in process? What are the most important qualities of a recital read?
Sure. I mean, so I've just put out a video about this for anybody who's interested on YouTube, just sort of detailing the first steps of how I break in reads. And that process just slowly gets the reed used to moisture and vibration. If we just pull a reed out of the box and we play it, that can be really traumatic. Might not ever make a good sound ever again. So really going slowly. Towards the end of that reed break-in process is when I might start addressing issues of like imbalance or response. Um, but usually I think, in a general way, for me anyway, I'm finding that a nice long break-in allows most reeds to play pretty well. I probably get 7 reeds out of a box that I don't really need to fuss too much with. Um, Beyond that, it becomes, it starts to become very like personal preference as to how we work on reeds, or do we seal them, do we not seal them. I do like to take some like 600 grit sandpaper and just sort of lightly buff the vamp just to make it really smooth, and it sort of helps that sealing process. It's not going to take off enough cane to really soften the reed or anything like that. And if the bottom feels a little bit, if there's some grit to it, I might do that on the flat side as well.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, is in terms of like balancing. If anyone is getting into more serious reed work, the method that I use and that I found the most helpful is Tom Ridenour's ATG method. It's super simple and really effective, and I've used that since, gosh, late high school, I think. And for me, it's always yielded a really good result without having to like spend a lot of time, because
Right.
I mean, we'd all just, I think, rather play and practice. So I highly recommend that. It's very affordable. It comes with like a really great book explaining all this, all the details to the method and the science behind, reeds as a springboard and all that stuff. It's very helpful.
Right. Right. Good. So on the second part of that question, though, so what are the most important qualities of a recital reed? I guess that's related back to exactly what you were talking about with tone concept and mouthpiece.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I didn't quite catch all the question, Dr. Nat.
Oh, sorry. What are the most important qualities of a recital reed?
Oh, a recital reed. Oh, um, yeah, the golden reed, of course. Um, for me, I think it's just about like clarity of sound and making sure that I'm able to work with it. Every time we play, if we put on a reed and we play, we're going to deal with that feedback. Like, what is this reed telling me? If it's too hard, we're going to compensate in some way. If it's too soft, we're going to compensate in some way. If it's just not responsive, we're going to compensate. So if I can find a reed that is, really like recital ready or whatever, um, it's going to be very responsive, and I'm not going to have to work too hard to, get what I want out of it.
Mm, yeah. So great. From Peter, have you ever commissioned a solo saxophone piece?
Yes, many over the years. Yeah, I've done a fair amount of commissioning. Um, Gosh, now trying to remember them all. This is the challenge, right?
Sure.
I would say in the last probably 10 or so years, most of it has been around the quartet, of course, because we try to stay very active with commissioning new works. But commissioning as a process is so crucial for us to make sure that, of course, we keep extending the literature forward, and also giving a voice to composers who maybe haven't written for the instrument or are new and upcoming or underrepresented. And it's great to see all the way down the line to young undergraduates and even now high school students getting involved in this process, because there's so much we can do to help foster the instrument forward, and creating new works is certainly a really, really big part of that. So talk to your composer friends, and get an idea of who's out there too. There's just so much happening.
Right. Um, from Olivia, do you find it challenging transitioning between horns? And if so, do you have a strategy for strengthening the areas of weakness?
Yeah, I would say to a certain degree, and I'll give a specific example. Several years ago, I was recording for a new CD and playing some tenor, and we recorded a track on tenor and then tried to move to the next piece, which is on alto, and I really had a hard time with that transition. Now that I'm sure is rooted in mostly for me that I'm not playing a lot of tenor these days. So it was already something that's not sort of in my typical practice routine. But when I get into those situations where I'm not feeling comfortable at a transition, just going back to a fundamental, even just for a few minutes, getting on the mouthpiece and just sort of getting reacquainted with working with the air and the oral cavity for the new voice is really helpful. Beyond that, of course, the more we do it, the more comfortable we'll become. Right. And just getting used to what that switch will, most likely feel like. For me, I'm tending to be more of an upper voice player, so moving soprano to alto is not really an issue. But when I've had to dip down into the ones that I'm just not playing very much, that's when I really have to be careful and remind myself about that fundamental.
Yeah. So you spend time finding the resonance, on the mouthpiece at first.
Yeah. Yeah, because otherwise I'd sort of end up, I think in that case I mentioned, I moved from tenor to alto, and I kept trying to play my alto like it was the tenor.
Sure.
Which was going to, of course, be a recipe for disaster.
Right. Right. That's one of the interesting things. It's a good question. I mean, I think finding the muscle memory, so to speak, of the approach just in general for the instrument, yeah. And then on both sides of the horn for classical or jazz, understanding what the differences and similarities are as well, and being able to just switch it's tough.
Yeah.
Great. How do you go about working with beginners to get a concept of a good tone? Like, what do you do with them first?
Well, I think for a beginner, the important thing is, do they know what a good tone is?
Right.
So it kind of goes back to that idea of listening. And actually, my studio we're going to do for a studio class, I think it's next week, coming up here anyway, before the end of the semester, is a listening guide for the advancing saxophonist, and everyone's going to make their own recommended repertoire or recordings, or maybe even make Spotify playlists or something like that. And I think that's really useful for young students. I remember I started in fourth grade, which I found out later was rather unusual, but that's when I started playing the saxophone. And I really thought, fourth grade Stephen Page sounded pretty good at the saxophone, until I started hearing what, like my friends in seventh and eighth grade, like how they sounded. And then suddenly that sound is in my ear. Okay, well, I'm going to start aiming there. So I think just like going back to some of the earlier things we talked about, imitation and knowing what we're aiming towards is always really, really helpful.
Right.
But I do think that, I think there's something to be said for starting young students with really great fundamentals, of course, and that means also introducing mouthpiece pitch.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess Nikki was talking about this too. Mm-hmm. Introducing techniques, like for me at least, vibrato is something that I think people, for some reason or another, tend to shy away from for a long time, and getting students understanding how that works and not having it be like an extra thing on top of it, but that it's built into it. How do you do that? Do you start vibrato as soon as they're ready, or do you kind of wait?
I mean, I guess Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question, right? Because vibrato is sort of the way we do it, moving the jaw. It's sort of like breaking a rule, right? When we're beginning, we're sitting like, okay, keep still, everything's just so, got it. And then we're like, okay, now move your jaw. And
Right.
we say like, wait, what? And so I think that can be a little bit challenging for some students. But I would say like if a student has like a good straight tone, like a nice full sound, and they can play a good full range chromatic scale, like that's probably a good sort of test for like, can we start introducing this concept?
Right.
But I think making sure, of course, always that we explain it really well and model, and because just like with anything, we can either create a false positive, by pulsing the air or what have you, or just not sort of immediately correct some, overdoing it because we use the jaw, like we're towing that line
Hmm.
and between biting and not biting, right? And so for a younger student who might not know where that line is, we just have to make sure we keep them, right in the middle of it.
Right. Right. All right. Good. And so, oh, this is a question from Colin, but I suspect we know the answer is, do your students mainly play on Rousseau's as well?
No, actually, I think I only have, I think one or two of my students play Rousseau. A lot of them play S80, or sorry, excuse me, S90 180. That's very popular in the studio. A couple 190s.
Yeah.
Various Van Dorns through the years, some Selmer concepts. I don't require my students to play anything. They can play whatever they like as long as it's comfortable for them and it's yielding a good result. That's fine with me.
Right. Right. Good. Um, from Stephen Banks, do you and how do you vary your expectations for undergraduate students of different majors, like music ed, therapy, performance? Like, what are you flexible about, and what aspects are non-negotiable?
It's a great question, and of course, I appreciate very much coming from Stephen. We've known each other a long time. He's a great person, great educator, wonderful musician. This is a tough one, right? And we get asked that all the time by students too. Um, again, for me as an educator, my job is to take a student as far as we can. So I personally try not to think about changing the expectations because everything I try to do is very tailor fit to the individual. We've got to meet students where they are. Everyone's going to come in with a different knowledge base, with a different previous experience, and with different goals. So, if you want to be, if you're let's say a music ed major, and your goal is to be a great band director, we're just going to turn you into the best possible musician we can by the time you leave our institution. And that happens in the applied setting. It happens in your music theory, music history, your conducting. All of that stuff needs to come together. Because when you stand on that podium and you direct your 6A high school band, we want to make sure that the level of artistry that you're expecting from your students is reflected in the level of artistry that you have yourself. So, really just aiming towards that idea of, high level artistry through informed interpretation and, a steadfast understanding of your own artistry, I think is a great thing. So I try not to, I guess in that very specific sense, think about like, okay, music ed majors only have to do X, Y, and Z, and performance need to do this. We all need the same skills, and maybe it's just the practical application afterwards that is different.
Right. Right. Yeah. Um, so it's reinforcing the artistry of it, and then the reflection of that back onto their students.
Yeah.
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 Um, so you talked about tension. Sorry, this is from Iceland. You talk about tension being the worst enemy. What are some things you do outside of technique on the horn to eliminate tension?
Um, Personally, I think I've been pretty lucky not to be super tense with the way I approach the instrument. So I've very thankfully, knock on wood, not had any performance-related injuries. But I just try to be very aware. Of course, having like a mirror is really helpful. So we can sort of check in on these things and check like, the left shoulder is a big culprit and check the wrists and the fingers. Um, the more we can identify areas that we have potential issue with, that there are tension, and then work towards alleviating that, the earlier the better, of course. I know a lot of musicians take great care to be involved with something that's helping their physical fitness, whether that's going to the gym in a certain way or yoga, Pilates are very popular. I did take an Alexander Technique course in my undergrad and have worked with Alexander technicians in the past. And I think that was pretty informative back then with some of my, like I talked about how I interact with the horn. So those were very memorable sessions. So I think all of that is really good for us. I know in my syllabus for the studio, I've also got some like stretching exercises included in that syllabus that they can do just to help with alleviating the tension or getting warmed up to play by stretching a little bit. I think that's all really helpful because we don't want anybody to have an injury. We don't want to see anybody in pain from playing. So the more we can do to prevent it, the better. If we have an issue, if I've ever had a student who's had a problem, I also have a list of doctors that I can refer them to. My wife actually just a few years ago had a cyst on her hand, like right on the top, and we were very lucky to get connected with a great surgeon who specifically works only with musicians, and he runs a nonprofit specifically for helping musicians here in Austin, but his main practice is in Manhattan, so he works with people in the Phil and the Met and all that stuff all the time. So having resources available for those who need them as well.
Right, right. Great. All right, we got one more question here, and this is a good one. Can you speak about some small long-term goals, i.e., 5 to 10 years?
I feel like I'm on a job interview.
What are your strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I mean, obviously for my artistry, like I want to keep growing. There's repertoire I still want to play. There are like collaborations I want to pursue. I just want to keep challenging myself and trying to continue to develop my voice and continue to grow because I'm not where I want to be yet. And that's really exciting. It's hard to imagine, even thinking backwards, like 10 years ago, I was in my doctorate at the University of Iowa. And, I wonder sometimes, like, what, certainly having thought the very same questions, what would I have said 10 years ago to myself? Like, what were my goals then? How have they changed now? And just as a brief tangent, like goal setting is hugely important for all of us. Both long term, like Ben has asked here, but short term, and then even shorter term. It's a process we do in my studio quite often, where they'll set a goal sheet at the beginning of the semester, and we check in and see how it's all going. But yeah, I mean, I want to keep growing my artistry. I'd love to keep doing some more recording projects. I have some things in the work that should be coming out in the next 6 months, and then another one hopefully in about a year that I'm pretty excited about. It's interesting too with like recording and the industry and all that, how it's changing, how we might release media. And so I'm pretty excited about that too, with some video projects coming up and some new and exciting things. And then, for me, the most important part of what I do is being a teacher. And I'm really excited to keep growing as a teacher myself and keep helping these students find their place in this world and achieve their goals. And, that's something that I'm super, super excited about. That's sort of what gets me out of bed in the morning. I love teaching and I love getting to work with these students every day. So I hope that I can keep, enabling people well. And that in 10 years, I can look back and think about all these wonderful individuals who are out there doing whatever they're doing and hopefully lighten the world on fire and feel really great about that. That's such a reward.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. You were talking about goals, and how the importance of goal setting, which made me think about one other thing, which was Angela Duckworth wrote a book called Grit.
Mm-hmm.
Have you read that book?
I have.
And one of the interesting things to me was the permanence or semi-permanence of goals, like long-term goals being fixed versus short-term goals being like, if we make short-term goals along the track of long-term goals, sometimes the short-term goals not meeting that right there can get in the way versus. You remember what I'm talking about like the move?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I remember this well. And, the thing with goal setting in a very general way is we're more likely to get things done if we set goals. Whether that's in your practice session, and I'm going to pull my horn out here when we're done and do some playing, or just for that practice session, like I'm going to get through my liqueur etude or my semine, and then I'm going to do this. We're more likely to succeed. And I think too, like for those of us who teach, we all know like we can hear growth so well over the 7 days between a lesson with a student, and being on the other side of that, like as the one who's trying to make the progress, that ability to zoom out as well and see the progress, but like setting those goals, like that's something that's like you can almost hold it in your hand in a way. Like, okay, my goal is to hit this tempo mark. My goal is to learn this piece. My goal is to finish this application or whatever. Like then we're making progress. Like that's going to help us continue to grow. So like every day, this is my notebook. I write down the things I'm going to do. And sometimes they don't get done, and
Right.
that's okay.
But
They just move to the next day. But it just helps me like keep thinking forward, like keep growing.
right, right. Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for doing this, and I'm super impressed that after on your birthday evening, you're going to go practice right after this. That's impressive.
Got to get that time in. Only got a little warm up in today before I started teaching, so it's time to put a little bit more time in.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for carving out some time to spend with us, and we really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and thank you everybody who've tuned in, and even just for a little bit, I so appreciate it. If you have any questions about anything I've said or anything else, email me anytime. Happy to hear from you always. Hope everyone has a really great end of the spring here.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and happy birthday again. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye bye.